The Jetsons Archie, Issue 1. George thinks he can take off on a vacation because he finally got a report done. Why did he say our vacation when nobody in his family's in the room? At least he's doing something realistic for his job instead of just pushing a button without a screen in front of him all day. Spacely goes into his room holding something, thankful that he's still there, so go figure he's gonna ask him to do something. At least it's something unexpected. He wants them to stop a recently discovered dangerous computer virus which could take months. He types on a computer and wants to see how good he is at solving virus problems, and the computer screen tells him to hide the whole mess in a vague file that'll take dozens of generations to find. He must have typed that down. Why would the average employee have access to a computer that can tell him stuff like this, complete with giving him reckless advice? It would have made a bit more sense if it was Rudy from the show. Why would it take 100 years to find when it's in a computer in his workplace which is full of other employees? Surely his replacements would immediately look through all of the files he's had access to and find the virus. He at least has a good reason for doing something dumb. He thinks it's smart and wants to take a vacation. So it's not an outright idiot ball. But it's still gonna be an idiot's plot because somehow Spacely trusted George with a task like this. Spacely should get suspicious that I'm claiming he got rid of the virus that fast when he said it would take months. At least we don't have to see him lie to Spacely. But I have a bad feeling about this issue if it's making me say at least that many times. He plans on taking his family to the newest theme park, which harkens back to the 90s. There's a make-your-own pollution ride, which would only be there if it wasn't actual pollution. And George almost walks in front of a normal car and calls it dangerous. Judy's impressed with people walking ahead carrying boom boxes for a marching band. As if that's supposed to represent the 90s. Realistically, these future people are exhausted after a 2-minute walk, and George decides to take a toxic waste ride past some chemicals with Astro. They won't really be toxic, or else it'd be illegal to have people near them. You'd think you'd have to explain this to Astro. Astro sniffs and does some digging, causing Elroy to go after him. George expects me to believe there's a hacking cough exhibit too. But at least all of this makes clear that the future isn't about pollution. Astro dug up Easter eggs, and one hatches open, revealing itself to be an alien that can already fly up to George to attack him, and they have to run away from dinosaurs, who I called aliens because they want to be able to survive the oxygen level of the atmosphere now. What's insulting is that we're supposed to believe these eggs were actually dinosaur eggs buried by the Flintstones when they're obviously alien eggs that were just laid because the eggshells in its contents couldn't have survived for 100,000 years. Not to mention, I really resent being expected to actually believe the Flintstones takes place that far back in time when it's modern society with a caveman flavor. I can't get over how random it is that they're running away from dinosaurs in a 90s theme park. But I can respect how creative it is. Even if it was totally unnecessary to cross over with the Flintstones, especially in the first issue. Judy compliments her mom on her stamina for getting money from a machine by hand. Now I know how the pioneers feel. She's carrying a bag of inflatable running shoes. Judy calls rap music classical music in a metaphorical sense. Somehow, George expects the lawyer to scare the dinosaurs away, and he stands still, and so does Elroy. And the lawyer talks to it instead of running away and questioning this. It was at least trying to justify itself by trying to be funny, and it is a charming joke. George immediately changes his mind and plans to run for the exit. George thinks the dinosaurs got Jane and Judy trapped. How does he know that if the dinosaur would be blocking his view of them? They can't hear the dinosaur because they have their headphones on listening to music. George saves them, and the dinosaur tail causes some damage in the mall. I don't think a dinosaur would eat clothes. Why is George even planning to fight one? They'd run. The dinosaurs end up disintegrating because they're somehow eating the clothes, and he somehow blames this on polyesters. They're definitely aliens then. That's believable, but I just wish it was explained. The fact that I can figure out how it makes sense, I guess that's enough to make this a good story, because it was interesting enough. Then out of nowhere, George gets lectured by his conscience to do something about the computer virus, and somehow his conscience is represented by Spacely. So he decides to go back to work while his family finishes vacation without him. In the next story, George and Elroy shoot beams while playing a virtual reality arcade game where they aren't actually moving. Eventually, George presses a button to make a ladder and painter bot come out of a box too small for them to fit, and he somehow feels like napping from exhaustion after that. Then a thief tries to steal Elroy's robot. He sure came over here easily. I like that Elroy stays brave and throws a lamp at him. Somehow he calls the thief a spy instead of just thief. So somehow George doesn't believe him and brushes off his serious complaints. He gets his partner to help him, and Elroy and the robot get kidnapped. Eventually, the robot ends up being revealed as a fighting robot in disguise and punches all the jerks with extendable arms. And a military man says the spies were trying to steal their secret weapon. Why did Elroy have this? Elroy thanks the general, who agrees to send Elroy home with the new robot. In the next page, Judy hopes George will be having dinner with the family, and Jane complains that he's been going out with his friends too much lately. In this alternate universe where he has friends. George calls her and says he can't come home for dinner because he has to test new products. He thanks her for the compassion, and it turns out he was just lying and compliments Spacely on the fake backdrop, making him look swamped with paperwork. When really, he was gonna play cards with Spacely and his friends. I like that Spacely has a new outfit for once. But since when does Jane consider Spacely to be his friend? In the next story, George plans to give Astro a bath and drives him to a pet store where Robot Claw grabs him by the collar. And he says he'll see him later, without even having to go inside. He somehow ends up being given the wrong dog, and he somehow assumes Astro was turned into a different dog, and assumes they used too much hot water to make that happen, instead of assuming witches or potion ingredients or technology is responsible. He shouldn't be upset about reasoning that it'll cost less to feed him, because that is an upside. He finds out someone in a tough neighborhood took his dog, and his car ends up threatened by a black hole. He somehow assumes space pirates would help him. His car gets destroyed, and somehow in the next panel he has a bubble helmet and is reduced to his boxers, and talks as if he was in a black hole. Because the writer doesn't think he has to care about logic because it's a cartoon art style. But even for the original Jetsons and its original comic, this is too silly. But at least it's exciting and interesting. An alien spits him out for tasting bad, and somehow, after he's sent through the window of a cop car, the cop says he's gonna have to pay for the window when it's obvious that it wasn't his fault. It turns out Astro's back, because instead of being lost, he got into the groomer's fridge. He hugs him, and because of Astro chasing a cat, he falls over on the dog-walking conveyor belt that's floating who knows how high above the ground, unrealistically dangerously. Or maybe there is grass under it in this comic. The conveyor would need to have gravity on the bottom that'd keep him near it at all times, or he'd take a huge fall after this. I know that in the show there's gravity on the bottom. The Jetsons Archie Issue 2. For some reason, Spacely's being driven home by George instead of driving home himself, so I have to just assume his car's broken down. It turns out George's car runs on antimatter, when usually it's said to be powered by gas in the comics, so that's an improvement. It never ran on gas in the show anyways. He decides to land the car on a planet to check it out. The only reason another planet would be on the way to Spacely's house is if in this universe Spacely lived on another planet for no reason, despite having his workplace be on Earth. At least that's creative, because in the show he did live on Earth. The car crashes into a prison planet. Spacely says things were so bad in the 21st century that everyone left New York City somehow. It's very lazy to not explain why. It would be dark to explain that they had a nuclear reactor meltdown, but at least it would try. I would rather they have a less dark, more fantasy or sci-fi explanation. This is almost intriguing world building, but it can't be taken seriously without a good explanation. Even saying it was attacked by Godzilla wouldn't justify literally everyone leaving. So this comic has to take place after the 21st century, which is a much needed improvement to the canon. They turned New York into a prison, and it became Nyok Nyok, which he just said was a prison planet. So how did a city on Earth turn into another planet? The prisoners eventually rebelled. Somehow only one congressman showed up at a meeting about it, and it was decided to launch New York into space, like I already saw in the Futurama comic. The congressman must have only recently gone nuts, or he'd be fired by now. Spacely expects me to believe the city was never seen again. It's not a planet if it's just one city in space, which has to have a machine on it dedicated to having it stay inhabitable because it's so small. They get intimidated by the people around them and decide to head for a tunnel. Someone behind them wants them to come back because they just want to talk. So they look like idiots by ignoring them and running into the cramped subway, ignoring someone who says they have something for them. So this is going to be a frustrating idiot's plot, but at least it has a message against judging a book by its cover. And it constantly changes the setting. They run towards a stage door and spend time participating in a dance for fun. They ride on a taxi and see giant rats trapped behind a fence. And it's a bit hard to take seriously that Spacely calls the river polluted, because it looks like water coming out of the tube. The people going after them are from the Tourist Bureau, and want to sell them worthless folders for the best kept secret in the galaxy. This place hasn't been a prison planet for generations, and instead it's a great place to live now. Realistically, as Australia had been a prison island and turned out fine. How did this place get kept a secret for 1 minute in the future? It doesn't even want to be a secret. The story ends with Spacely saying he was happier when this was a prison planet, even though he was running for his life. And I have to assume it's because of all the money wasted at the gift shop, but they had no reason to buy from it. I guess Spacely bought from it because he thought his wife would get mad at him if he didn't, but he could have just bought one thing or never told his wife about it at all. In the next story, George flies ahead in rocket boots and has no idea what he's doing up here somehow, let alone how to stop. We see a few minutes ago where the whole family's impressed by their new supersonic hoverblades. They won't literally be supersonic, because humans couldn't survive that amount of G-force unless they use magic force fields to create a stasis around people to protect them from super speed. Like the fact that the sudden stop would kill them. Elroy says they're controlled with a handheld control unit, and if someone drops it, they're screwed. These would be considered too dangerous to sell because morons would get hurt by them somehow. He increases the speed, and of course he drops the control. It should have been something that he could strap to his wrist. He can't stop, but you'd think he'd at least be able to try to steer to the left or right and avoid crashing into the birthday cake. At least the cake isn't ruined. He's still holding its plate with it on it. It's too bad the cake gets splattered on someone, and George ends up taking a trophy. Realistically, the family can't catch up to him because he had a head start and is faster than them. Elroy gets an idea. George heads for a painting in an outdoor art show and crashes through it. At least he crashes into a mugger saving people, so this was worth it. But there's no reason he'd be so oblivious as to say something like this. It's funny that he's called a brave man while he's begging for someone to help him. Elroy puts 4 skates on Astro so he'll be twice as fast as them. They can't be skated on, so they're not skates. Astro gets sent ahead holding the remote control in his mouth. He catches up to George, getting him the remote so he won't crash, and gets offered genuine synthetic steak. What a silly name. He sees kids on hoverboards and gets tempted by them, which is confusing because he clearly hated his ride. So the flash forward was just a confusing waste of space because he didn't really end up with amnesia. The story ends with Jane telling him not to consider it as Astro hugs him and his family shows him affection. In the next page, Elroy is shown being unusually smart for a kid, as he asks George if space is finite. George is smart enough to know that space just keeps going on forever, and we end up seeing people far away churning butter, even though they're living with space helmets on a floating space platform. The platform must have a way to keep itself warm enough for them to not need an outright spacesuit. Why does the kid even have a fishing pole here? And it's a bit confusing for them to be humans if they're that far away from Earth. The next story isn't a story, it's just mean and confusing, being a montage of George on the show for the world's biggest losers. No one would willingly agree to be featured on it. They were allowed to say the word suicide in a Jetsons comic, but somehow the modern Sonic comic has a never say die or killed policy. How could George have been made vice president 78 times? At least it's satisfying to see Judy get exposed for being nothing but a character that's boy crazy. You'd think she'd be impressed by their talking dog. At least we end up seeing the hosts get catty with and fight with each other. And it ends with George saying he's glad to be the world's most normal family. But there's nothing to talk about with this story. It just reminds the audience of stuff they already know. The first story is about George taking his family to a 90s theme park, but sadly that's barely the focus, because it ends up being about him being threatened by dinosaurs out of nowhere. Because it's creative to have old dinosaur eggs totally alive here. But it really could have done with actual logic too, with the writer caring enough to explain that they're aliens who just showed up, instead of treating me like a gullible moron and shoving the Flintstones in here. It was charming to see the characters' reactions to the 90s, even if they barely ever got to have any. I wanted to know what the computer virus would do, and thought that'd be the basis of the plot, but it never did anything. At least that means the story wasn't an idiot's plot, because the conflict wasn't caused by George's mistake. The second story is about a robot playmates of Elroy's getting threatened by kidnappers for some reason, getting Elroy to fend off one in a cool moment, just for him to get kidnapped. And then the robot somehow waits until the last second to reveal himself as a secret fighting robot of the military to fight back. I don't know why Elroy had him then. I hated that George was totally dismissive of Elroy's warnings just because Elroy was forced by the writer to call the thief a spy. The final story is about George getting given the wrong dog somehow, and then driving around in a dangerous part of space looking for him. It's the 90s, and we're still just seeing aliens get portrayed as monsters. I feel like this comic's a bit of a step down in quality from the last ones. But it could be worse, because they're all still good, if disappointing. At least I can say the comic isn't predictable like the 60s comic is. It's interesting enough to be good. The first story is an exciting plot where George runs out of antimatter in his car when inexplicably driving spacely home, and because the place he lands on is a prison planet, they spend a long time running around scared of everyone, despite it looking like a regular crowded city. But it's quickly obvious that they aren't actually in danger because someone has something for them. So it's frustrating how dumb they are. But I'm glad it keeps changing setting to try to keep it interesting. How does Spacely not know this place changed to being a perfectly good city? After George ends up on out-of-control hover skates, the rest of the comic space is wasted on telling the audience stuff they already know about the Jetsons as characters, while TV show hosts mock them for it. And I'm just wondering why they agreed to be on their show. But the story doesn't care about important things like that, so I don't care about it.